You are listening to the Prepared Warrior Podcast, where law enforcement and military trainers discuss cutting-edge training, tactics, and technology. Here is your host, John Wilson.
Welcome to Season 1, Episode 5 of the Prepared Warrior. I'm John Wilson. Our guest for this episode is Tony Blauer. I always like to start every episode with a quote. This one is from Ed Parker, who said, "He who hesitates meditates in a horizontal position." Very excited to bring our guest in today, Tony Blauer. He has been in the martial arts, self-defense, and defensive tactics and combatives industry for almost 4 decades and is one of the only combatives experts who has successfully effected training across all the combat-related communities, self-defense, combat sports, and the military and law enforcement sector. His research on physiology, mindset as it relates to confrontation management has influenced over 3 decades of reality-based martial artists. Blauer developed the Spear system of self-defense and also designed High Gear, a line of impact reduction suits for self-defense training. Thank you so much for coming, Tony. How are you doing today?
I'm good, man. I'm actually excited, for the show. I've been fans of you guys and the team and everything we're doing for decades. Yeah,
it's awesome to have you, and this is gonna be great. So your path has been very unique. It reminds me a lot of Bruce Lee. Over your life, you seem to have obsessively studied and refined your training for violent encounters. Where did your passion for this come from?
Ironically, Bruce Lee was a spiritual mentor guide. I never met him, but that's why I say spiritual, as he was for tens of thousands of martial artists and martial arts instructors. But my passion for this started or way earlier than I discovered Bruce Lee. Most people, discovered Bruce as the icon in 1973. And, when he passed away and Enter the Dragon was released. So I was 13 years old at the time, but I had started, what we now look at as a combat sports, as wrestling, right? In MMA, like solid wrestlers have a good platform to move into MMA. Mm-hmm. And so I had started wrestling, scholastic, like intramural competition, stuff like that when I was 7, 8, 9, 10. I used to live in Montreal, Canada. And so I had that foundation there, but my whole life, I felt like I was always waiting for something to happen. I had this weird, it was a fear. What if there was an attacker here? What if someone tried to grab me here? And it was almost obsessive. It didn't debilitate me in terms of, how I functioned as a person. But I can remember, like, as a 7-year-old walking, going, what if someone's on the other side of the corner there? Where, maybe I should move out here, or I would get ready for stuff. And it was bizarre. And I didn't realize it till, over, let's say 10, 15 years later, when I really started moving towards teaching self-defense and practicing it, that my whole life had always been about anticipating danger.
Wow. And so how did that path kind of, you got into self-defense and anticipating danger, and then it just naturally led you to teaching law enforcement tactics as well?
I wish it was just as easy as like flipping a switch. Yes. And, one day I was here and I was, no, I mean, it was a very organic journey. It wasn't, I didn't hire like a New York marketing firm and go, I want to teach self-defense. Give me a cool acronym. Yeah. How's SPEAR? Oh, spontaneous protection, enabling accelerated response. I'll buy that now. It was decades and decades of work. And so I had always naturally been a teacher. As I grew up in my teens, I was teaching skiing, I was teaching tennis. I loved coaching, mm-hmm. and I loved helping people like that, like the little spark you'd see in their eyes when they understand a move, or they just get it. So that always excited me. And of course, blending. It was probably a natural evolution, blending my fascination and love of all martial arts. You know, there's a story I tell in a lot of podcasts because people want to know, well, what were the milestone steps that led you to here? Sure. And basically, so I had wrestling as a foundation, which gave me close quarter strength and balance, but intuitive, like you didn't know. Like when you're 11 or 12 or 13, you're not going, oh, my proprioception's been heightened due to my, like you're not thinking, right? Mm-hmm. And so I got into a confrontation that escalated into a physical fight in high school. And I'd started Taekwondo and I've been studying, for a couple of years. And my instructor, Alex, I revered him. And he would told all the students on a regular basis, if I catch you fighting outside of the school, you're out, you're done. You only use martial arts for self-defense. And I really took that to heart. And I was, with a bunch of kids at school that a teacher went out of the school, and right away, a couple of guys started teasing like the class nerd, like the typical guy with the glasses with the tape, like that. It was that guy. Mm-hmm. And his name was Lance. And I can't believe I just remembered his name all these years later. Because that was like, I'm 58 now. I was like 15 and a half, when this happened. And so I'm standing there, and of course they're like teasing him and everything, and it starts to get a little physical. And once someone's like looking out, seeing is the teacher coming yet, and then one of them pushes Lance, and the other guy had kneeled down behind him. That little stupid prank that can be very dangerous. And Lance falls over and falls into a cabinet there, and all the whole class, like 20 kids in the class, start erupting, and he flashes red and looks up, and I'm laughing too. Now, I didn't do anything. I wasn't poking. I was just like real close. But he looked at me as like maybe I was the guy that had tripped him. And he shoved me and came right at me. And it was just this, hey, man, you got the wrong guy. And I'm trying to talk him down, right? And he's like in my face, and I'm going, and I hear this voice in my head. And it's Alex's voice. If I catch you fighting outside the school, you're out. And I'm going, oh, shit, if this gets back to Alex, like, Hannah, there's no way. So I'm trying to diffuse this, and he's pushed me, and now my back is to the wall in the classroom, and there's still no teacher, and everyone's, like, circling, going, like silently going, fight, right? Yeah. And he's escalating. I'm like, what the hell? And so visualize this. My back is to the wall, and he's in my face, like at that, like just almost like headbutt, poking my chest. Mm-hmm. And I got a voice in my head. It's Alex going, if I catch you fighting. And on the other side of my head, and this is no bullshit, there's another voice going, he's too close to kick. He's too close to kick. He's too close to kick. Mm-hmm. And I'll always remember that, because I was so infatuated with Taekwondo that all the time I was stretching and kicking. And when you're a teenager, and even like for most, like there's an unconscious bias that's created when you're a Taekwondo practitioner, and that's trying to kick people in the face, right? Hook kick, side kick, round kick, whatever it is. And it's not like anyone out there who's a Taekwondo practitioner, this isn't a knock. If you're a boxer, you have an unconscious bias for punching, for hitting at the head, hitting to the body. If you're a knife fighter, you have an unconscious bias to get to your blade and to work on some of your patterns. So the unconscious bias is something we might talk about later, because it's a psychological blueprint that can change your reaction time, where maybe you need to run or play dead, but you're doing a side kick. And you find yourself like, that was like, you don't want to find out in a real fight, that was the move you shouldn't have done. Right. So anyways, back to the story. Mm-hmm. There's part of me going, he's too close to kick. And then there's Alex going, if I catch you fighting. And just then Lance looks at me, shoves me, and I could see his carotids, and his neck like flaring, and he's turning red. And he's like calling me a cow, pussy, and all this. And then he goes, I'll let you have the first punch. And here's the thing is, I knew, because I've been trying to diffuse it for about 30 seconds, I knew that he wasn't letting go, that there was going to be a fight. There was just that intuitive moment where this is going to go violent. Mm-hmm. And so when he said, I'll let you have the first punch, I hit him on the letter U. And so as he's saying, pa, and my hands are up, I fire one of the worst jabs in the history of striking, right? Because I had no boxing experience. All I knew was like the classic reverse punch and back fist from traditional Taekwondo back in the 70s, right? So I hit him with this jab. He gets nailed. He arches back, and then he throws that windmill classic John Wayne sucker punch reaction. Well, as I hit him with the jab, and I see him, he didn't go down. He didn't step back, and he recoils for the punch. My hands come up. Now here, like flash ahead to everything I'm doing now, startle, flinch, convert. My hands come up to protect my head, almost like an organic airbag, right? My hands come up, fingers splay, and I'm just covering my head in what we now call the protective position. And his forearm careens around, hits my hands, and I find, serendipitously, his head is right in front of my fingers, right? So we always talk about closest weapon, closest target, right? Your best move might trigger his best counter. And so here he is right in front of me, and I grab him by the hair, and suddenly all my wrestling training came back. And I pulled him right into, like a little hip throw. I threw him to the ground. I never let go of his hair. I whipped him over my hip on the ground. I was still holding his head, and that kind of like surprised him. I then grabbed him and flung him into the desk that was adjacent to us, where his back hit the desk and kind of winded him, and he was stunned on the ground. And at that point, so imagine the chaos right there. Shitty jab, whap, right? Boom, shitty jab happens. He comes flying back. My hands come up. A shitty throw. I grab him on the ground. I throw him into the desk. He's stunned, and then now I'm in a stance pointing down at him. So I'm in like this long stance, and I yell at him because my adrenaline erupts. If you get up, I'll fucking kill you. I was like so like scared at that point, right? And just like a minute later, or seconds later, the teacher walks in, and everyone scurries to their desk, and we get up, and my adrenaline's pumping. And here's the whole point of the story: is I noticed years later, not at that time, introspecting and reverse engineering what exactly happened, that the only time that I was in a martial stance was after the fight.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And that kind of blew my mind. But here's one of the biggest like research discussions that I like to have when I'm working on, a lot of my work now is working with experienced trainers on program management and understanding brain-based learning, right, and how to incorporate instincts, intuition, intelligence, and understand the neuron myelinization connection in how we teach people. And what did I do is I said to myself, remember, I'm like 15 and a half, 16. I think I was just getting my learner's permit. And think of the irony of this. This wouldn't have happened if my jab had connected properly. I blamed it on my striking. So what did I do as a kid who just got his learner's permit and just got in a fight? And I didn't feel like I won it, because when I say to anybody, describe a fight, what we see are like techniques and movement and like a movie. But when you actually look at surveillance, CCTV of actual fights, it never looks like a movie. It always looks like shit. Yeah. And so what did I do? I went to boxing club, and I spent years studying boxing, and still love boxing to this day and everything. But my fixation on there, the emotional reaction was my toolbox was incomplete. Instead of understanding more about detect and avoid, defuse and de-escalate, the science and psychology of controlling your fear and understanding psychologically how to. So fast forward to that, I boxed. Being influenced by Bruce Lee, of course, everything was eclectic. I started teaching when I was 17. Within 6 months of starting teaching, I had 30. So I was 17. I had 30, 15, and 16-year-olds as private students from the time I was like 17, 18, 19, 20. He obviously didn't start with 30, but it built, one kid and then his buddy and his buddy. And it started again, beautiful, like organically. I was working in my father's office as a shipper, and his best customer, this guy, Joey, his son was having some bully issues at school. This kid, Mitch, was 15 years old. And he asked me if I would train him. And I think I was about 20 when that happened now. And this is a long time ago, so the dates don't matter, but approximately 1980, I started training this kid. A few months later, he got into a confrontation with this bully. And I was always very mindful about the law and the ethics. And Mitch, the 15-year-old, go, what should I do with this guy? I go, Mitch, you don't know anything about movement. You don't know how to move your head. You don't know how to block. You don't know how to strike. So I suggest you avoid getting into a fight, right? So it was like pretty straightforward. And then, and I would always say, no such thing. We're not going to, no retroactive shit, man. Like if he's not putting his hands on you, it's just emotional abuse. That sucks. The school's not doing anything about it. But your dad wants me to train you. If it ever goes physical, that you got a fighting chance. We make sure that you can protect yourself. So one day, about 3 months into training, he was doing one private a week. I come over to his home where I was, doing the class, and I get there and he's like livid. He's red. He's pacing. Like you can see the proverbial smoke coming out of his ears, and he starts swearing. This guy, and I go, calm down, man. I don't understand. He describes what happens. He's late for class. He's running for class. He comes around the back of the school, and there's a bunch of kids sitting on the locker bank there, and the bully sees him coming, sticks his leg out, like leans out and trips Mitchell. He goes flying in front of a bunch of kids. Again, 15, embarrassed in front of all these kids. His books go flying. But this is like now 3 months of emotional abuse. Mitch is picking up his books and he's muttering. And Mitch is going, "You fucking asshole." And he's like, and the guy goes, "What did you call me?" Yeah. And he goes, "What the fuck, man? I don't even know who you are. You've been bugging me since school started." And guy goes, "What did you call me?" And he pokes Mitchell. And Mitchell just loses it, right? And he grabs him, and they're near the locker bank. He grabs him, single arm grab, and slams him against the locker bank and says, "Leave me the fuck alone." And he's explaining this to me, and he stops talking. I go, and he looks down, and he looks at me, goes, "He punched me in the face really hard and knocked me down." I'm like, "Mitch, what do you mean he punched you? Like, why didn't you, this was years before Karate Kid, but like I said to him, essentially, why didn't you do wax on, wax off? Like, why didn't you block? Why didn't you slip?" Because I'd incorporated, when we would spar, an eclectic blend, right? We would do pads work, shadow boxing, but I was blending my boxing, right, from my fight. So, so I'd been boxing for 5 years and Taekwondo for 8 years and all, and wrestling. And I created my own intuitive version of this is like 13 years before the UFC, my own version of MMA, if you will. And I go, like, "Why didn't you do anything?" And he looks at me, and you got to visualize this. And I know this is just audio, but everyone listening to this, he looks at me. I go, "Why didn't you block or parry or slip it or something?" And he looks down, and he looks up, and when someone's trying to like visualize what's happening, they look up and to away, right? You can see their eyes dart up and they're looking up. And he goes, "I was holding him because he didn't remember how it happened. It was just suddenly he was down." He goes, "I was holding him with my left hand against the locker bank, and I had my books in my right hand." And if you visualize that, what he's done is he's tied up both his blocking and striking tools. Yeah. Now, 15 years later, through my research with physiology and kinesiology, we understand that in the part of your startle flinch mechanism is that when you flinch, at the moment you're flinching, it's an explosive micro contraction in your body. You can't be fighting while you're flinching. This is important for cops to understand, for soldiers, and anyone interested in self-defense. If I say, "Hey, I want you to do this block," and I scare you just before you do that, and you flinch at that micro moment, you can't redirect that nerve impulse. The flinch, the reactive brain bypasses all cognition. And that is why you see, like in forensics, if you see someone goes through a car windshield, there's always trauma on the hands and the forearm. In a knife fight, there's always trauma on the hands and the forearm, a frontal attack, and so on and so forth. Lots of evidence and lots of scientific explanation for this. But what happened with Mitchell is in that moment, I had this like 1980, I'm 20 years old. It was like the god of self-defense hit me with a lightning bolt. I went, "Oh my God." Because what I saw was a kid with his left arm on the lapel holding his school books. And imagine if you had to box somebody where they said, "Okay, my hands are free and you hold onto my shirt and hold your books here." I mean, how soon do you get punched in the face? Immediately, right? Mm-hmm. Now, here's the big factor for those of you listening. When you flinch, as I said, your hand contracts. So when the guy fired the punch and Mitch's nervous system picked up danger, he locked up. And if you're holding on to whatever you're holding on to, you clamp down harder. So what he did is he could not release the extensor chain, which is anything for blocking and parrying, his flexor chain gets activated. And what he did is he gripped his books tighter and he gripped the shirt tighter, making the impact more solid on his face. And that's part of how he got dropped. Like, it's fascinating to me, like decades later, to be able to articulate that. But at the moment, all I got was this: fuck, we teach self-defense wrong. And what I meant was, I had been sparring with him to teach him. And in that moment, I realized we need to only do scenarios. If we're going to teach people to think through real problems, we need to build them. I use the term now, reverse engineer the scenario. And what I did that day, we worked on all the different things that he could have or should have. And what we're doing is creating mental blueprints for possibilities. Now, here was the thing, is they didn't use the term social experiment back then, but I did a social experiment where I asked some self-defense instructor buddies of mine. I posed the question to them, hey, this happened to my student, what do you think went wrong? Just to see where their head was at. Every single one of them gave a technical answer for why he failed the fight. And I need to illuminate this a little bit, because what I did is I took responsibility and felt like shit. I actually I wrote about this once. I apologized to him. I said, Mitch, I apologize. He goes, why? I lost the fight. I go, no, I didn't prepare you properly. I was teaching you how to spar and how to do complex motor skills. If he does this, you do that. And that just doesn't work. And what I did is, when I did that social experiment where I asked instructors, it was like, well, he shouldn't have had things in his hands, or he was too close. This guy was a better striker. He should have stayed at kicking range. Mm-hmm. And I was like, wow. And it wasn't that they were malicious, but they were seeing it through, come full circle to the unconscious bias. They were seeing it through the mechanics of their style or their system, and how you would do this move or that move. And that's just not the way real violence happens. The bad guy controls the fight in a real. You got to figure out how to win it, but the bad guy dictates the location, level of violence, and how and when the fight starts.
Yeah, and the environment's completely different than when you practice. Yeah. So now, moving on to when you've been teaching law enforcement, what would you say were your initial thoughts and opinions on how officers were preparing for violent encounters when you saw what training was like?
Yeah, so let me jump ahead, because it was 1993 when I first started teaching cops, and I had some police come into my school in Montreal, but they were they weren't coming there, as a police department or as a defensive tactics instructor. It was just somebody who had heard about me. Right. I'd started getting into the martial art magazine, so people would come in and go, "Oh, I didn't know you're in Montreal." Mm-hmm. But they were coming in and just doing my approach to preparation for violence. And so, what actually, 13 years went by. So there's almost another decade, the whole 10,000 hour stuff. So here we are 2 decades into, and what I'm, at that point from 1980 on, all we did is everything was scenario driven. So scenario. What's a scenario? And then we would create, and it's funny, here we are, over 20, 30 years later, there's all this neuroscience explaining ways to hack the brain, mm-hmm. to create a skill set, and everything I was doing back then is actually consistent with a lot of this research. And they're doing studies on how to learn the violin more quickly, how to learn math more quickly. It's not, but it's the exact same protocols, understanding how the brain studies and learns. But how I got into law enforcement and what I saw there was actually again, I love the word serendipity. I had, because of all the scenario work I started doing in 1980, I started to visualize what a dynamic scenario training suit would look like. And I started sketching it. And I sketched it head to toe in 1988. because I've been doing scenarios for 13 years, like almost every month I would do a seminar, and I saw some very high level people just go fetal in confrontations, right? Because what we would do in the beginning, we'd have write on an index card, what would you do if someone came up to you and you did this? What would you do here? What would you do here? And we'd have people discuss that. And what it was revealing is the unconscious bias. Well, I'm going to headbutt. I'm going to do an uppercut. I'm going to do, my favorite move is sweep the leg, right? Whatever it is. And then we would set up a scenario where we'd have props in confined spaces, and we would have dialogue. Hey buddy, you got the time. Someone looks at their watch and they get jumped. Like they're not. It was so different than just being in the ring and tapping gloves.
Right.
And so people, even people who had like serious physical skills and mental skills, if you change the timeline of the confrontation, right? If I think I'm supposed to fight Friday night in this weight class, and while I'm resting in the changing room like 2 hours before, you come running in and start punching me in the face, I might lose that face because my timeline for preparation. That's why we say the bad guy controls the location, the duration of the fight, and the level of violence. And so here I am doing these scenarios, and I go, man, we need gear, because we were using like a hockey helmet, gauntlets, taekwondo chest guard, baseball shin guards. Like it was this like Frankenstein collection. Yeah. Took 5 years to get the gear together, and then I said, I don't know anything about manufacturing, but I'd heard about the Red Man suit. And Gary Klugowitz at the time was the chairman of ASLET, the American Society of Law Enforcement Trainers. Didn't know him, didn't know them, didn't know anything about teaching police. And what I did was I contacted Red Man in Sebastian, Florida. I said, hey, I've got this new suit. I want you to maybe have manufacture it. They go, well, we're not going to do anything without signing an NDA, and we're not going to do anything unless our law enforcement guy vets it, right? Mm-hmm. And so Gary happened to be up in Canada at a high liability conference. I drove 5-6 hours to somewhere in Ontario, and we ended up talking for 5 hours, like into the morning after he finished teaching. And we're in a cab the next day, and he says to me, he says, I don't think Red Man will be interested in your gear the way you do it, because Red Man is like thick and bulky, like creating that space. Yep. My prototype was super thin. My idea was the gear cannot change the movement of the role player. And if you change the movement of the role player, you change the experience of the defender. If my target is too far away because the gear is too thick, then I'm developing a skill to hit a target that doesn't exist in real life. If I can't handcuff or grapple or put somebody in a car or in a trunk or like you, so there was a lot of restrictions to it. Now, there's a time and a place for a fist suit and a Red Man suit, but it wasn't for what I did. And I had a vision, and I spent 5 years building this vision. And we called it impact reduction technology, because I wanted the practitioner getting hit to be worried about getting hit, because I wanted there to be actual fear in the training. Because if there was no fear, people start doing the Superman shit. Well, why did you let him kick you like that so you could grab your gun? Well, if you can't feel anything, you do stupid shit. But if you're worried that maybe that elbow or that knee is gonna like wind you or drop you, then you start to move like, guess what? A real human. So wanted in the gear, took me years to do. Gary's there. He says like this is so opposite of what the Red Man suit is. I don't think they're going to be interested. But in explaining my approach to scenario training, Gary says to me, I've been around for 20 years. I fought in Japan. I run a jail. I've seen fights. I've been in fights. He says, I've never heard like any of these ideas. Like some of the stuff you're talking about will make cops safer. He said, I'm the chairman of ASLET, and this is exact words, I would be doing the law enforcement community a disservice if I didn't put you in front of them. He said, can you make it to Dallas? And it was like a month later. He said, the thing's already booked, but I'm the chairman. I'm going to set up, and he put me there. It was 1993. He told everyone about it. We had Caliber Press people there. We had every Mossad Ayub, we had all the gurus back there. Mm-hmm. And it was very interesting. I'm in the class and I'm talking about reactionary gap. I'm talking about mindset. I'm talking about presumed compliance. And there's everyone sitting there, and then going like, okay, here's this Canadian who's not a cop telling us the reactionary gap is a dangerous premise and it's responsible for a lot of ambushes on cops. And he's essentially saying there's no such thing as a reactionary gap. Who the hell is he? At the first break, about a third of the class left. They were sitting there with their arms crossed, but a bunch of people stayed. And that was, I immediately, in 1993, I immediately started, getting business, but it was because of Gary Klugowicz's integrity, and recognizing. And I say this, that I'm still friends with the guys at Redman. It's a completely different thing. And I still thank Gary decades later that if he didn't have the integrity, Robert Willis, and he's retired now, and Gary wrote these 2 encyclopedic books for law enforcement called Tactical Edge and Street Survival. Bob saw me teaching a year later, and he said, "You teach the 2 seconds before the fight, the rest of us teach." Right? Oh, yeah. And it was like that moment where you're there going, "Oh, fuck, here we go." And it was understanding that, because what you do in those 2 seconds heavily influences what happens in the next 2 seconds. So that's how I got into law enforcement. And what I saw was in law enforcement, and again, this is just me as a scientist, researcher. What I saw was a continuation of what I saw in martial art training. Even though they weren't wearing gis, they were in uniforms and they had training props and stuff like that. Yeah. It was still the same. Okay, when he grabs you here, you do this. Okay, if the bad guy comes at you, and in the action, in the physics of action versus reaction, action is always faster. And if you're always setting it up, so for example, one of the big light bulb moments that I create in our classes is we talk about weapon retention drills, and I'll say, like, how many of you practice weapon retention? Every cop puts their hand up. I go, how did the drill start? And 99.99999% of the time, it's a drill where the role player grabs your gun, you practice pinning it and securing it, hitting the radial nerve, locking out the elbow, doing a takedown, striking. But it always starts with the role player grabbing the gun. And so I say, okay, if action's faster than reaction in an ambush, who's action? Well, it's always the bad guy. I go, so you're letting the bad guy move first. Yeah. You're not integrating anything about the reactive brain, startle flinch, amygdala, limbic system response, right? And what's interesting is there's another Caliber Press video. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it's super old. Ultimate Survivors, and it's interviews with cops who lost their guns in inside the reactionary gap. And every single one of them said he target glanced my gun and then he was on me. Mm-hmm. None of them were able to pull off any of the retention moves. Why? Because what people aren't factoring in their training is the emotional, psychological impact, not just the physical impact. Yeah. So everyone practices starting from the physical. So when I do the weapon retention reframe, I go, hey, and this is years before the 10,000 hours metaphor. I go, let's say now what I say is y'all are familiar with the 10,000 reps, 10,000 hours mastery principle. Yeah. So if you do 10,000 reps in weapon retention, where the bad guy grabs your gun and you pin it, guess what you have done 10,001 reps of? And everyone looks at me. I go, you've done 10,001 reps of letting somebody grab your gun. Yeah. That will mess up your perception speed in a real confrontation, because you started it. The blueprint is, I'm going to let somebody target glance my gun and then reach for it. And then when he gets to here, I'm going to do a move. And that's how the brain gets organized. So, when you asked me, 10 minutes ago, what did I see in DT? What were some of the problems? Yeah. A lot of real good guys out there, but there was a lot of the training was done archaically in terms of like almost like white belt, yellow belt, or this is more advanced. And it was always like, hey, get me in a headlock. I'll show you how to get out of a headlock. Yeah. And I'm saying, hey, how do we stop somebody from even putting the headlock on? That's where our focus should be.
Do you think the advent of new like intermediate weapons has led to a reduction of empty-handed training for law enforcement? Kind of being reliant on weapons as like the sole solution, to subject control?
That's a great question. Mm-hmm. So the obvious answer is, of course, right? Mm-hmm. In 1988, I created a principle called Be Your Own Bodyguard. Mm-hmm. decades later now we have an actual seminar called Be Your Own Bodyguard. But the premise of it is like, you got to be the naked warrior. You got to be able to do this stuff without your equipment. Yeah. And if there is a gap in your competence and your confidence, then that taser, OC, baton, even a gun becomes your life vest in a holy shit moment. And so definitely, training everywhere, even in the civilian world of self-defense, all the way up to the tactical training for citizens, civilians, and a lot of people interchange the terms, but only military, personnel can refer to us as civilians. We're all citizens, but every citizen needs to understand the emotional, psychological side of it, because you're not going to defend yourself or your family. And that goes for cops too. We got to get that in their head. And so what happens is you're there and you're actually threat discriminating, going, oh, good thing I have a taser. I need it now, as opposed to, I got to get to my taser. Right. Yeah. And so and you see that, the bell curve continues to dip on, as the world gets more pussified and PC,
Now, back to the great news about high gear. Now, you were saying how you were directly involved in kind of designing that for high impact training, and I guess you had left, and now you come back to high gear. How does it feel to come back to something you originally created?
It's funny, as you said, that I feel like it was like Steve Jobs' Apple metaphor, where started the company, left the company. For about 8 years, I stepped away. There were some business events in 2010 in the States that I just stepped away and just focused exclusively on training. And we're still doing that in a heavy way. We're busier than ever, but we're back in control of high gear in turn, create the message of its value and pardon the pun, impact during impact training, and really get back at what is important now. Lou Holtz has a great acronym, WIN, win. Everyone wants to win, but his acronym for win is what's important now, and to recognize that that sometimes we confuse technical for tactical, and we need to be getting people to think tactically, not technically, and that singular over focus on what is the right move here, what is the technique of it, as opposed to focusing on primal gross motor movements that are easier to perform under high stress situations. And the ultimate, borrowing 3 letters from the CrossFit community that I'm very close with, they talk about MCI, mechanics, consistency, intensity. Mechanics, consistency, intensity. And so when an instructor says, okay, this is the scenario, and this happens a lot, and officers aren't, handling this properly. And I always make this joke, like all over the world, cops get sucker punched, get their gun grabbed, get pushed or tackled. If you look at dashboard video or body cam and over again, it looks like it's the same bad guy choreographed every fight, right? If this is a bad movie with bad choreography, it's like the same guy, that same attack again. But somehow the defensive tactics community hasn't figured out how to intercept that, right? And so we're still doing wax on, wax off too. We're too technical. What we need to do is explain, okay, here's how we improve situational awareness. And I'm not talking about, is that a bad guy over there? I'm talking about, did that guy just target glance my gun? Okay, here we go. Are my hands in the best place if something starts to happen? Like having your hands down in front of your gun when you're within arm's reach of somebody is ridiculous. So we have a whole series of what we call nonviolent postures, where you use them as like a Trojan horse metaphor, up close and personal. And by having your hands up higher and moving, you predispose yourself to startle, flinch, and cover your head faster, and you keep your fast twitch muscle fibers moving. So you're not developing some sort of like stymied position because you're just in that steeple position in front of your belt because somebody said to you, keep your hands near your gun.
Right.
right? Within arm's reach, if you can't get your gun out if somebody sucker punches you. What you need to do is protect your head, make sure you don't get dropped, so that now the suspect can grab your gun or kick you in the face. So there's a lot of, so when we decide what is important now, that becomes the mechanics. And that's startle, flinch, convert. And then it's to control and arrest. I need to control myself and then control the opponent, and then I need to move in primal gross motor. So mechanics, consistency, and then what is the intensity piece? Well, the intensity piece requires a suit like high gear, where I can have a role player who can come in and whisper, I ain't going back. You can talk clearly in high gear, right? Yeah. If you got again, I said it earlier, if like the high gear suit is like 10 pounds head to toe. So I could literally, put 4 guys in a car in high gear suits and have 2 cops go do a vehicle extraction and say to one guy, you're going to be the guy that runs, you're going to be the guy that attacks the cop. The other 2 people just stand there, and nobody's color coded. We don't have somebody blue and somebody red and somebody's wearing a simunition, headgear and so, because what happens is if we color code or code people because of the certain gear, some of my observations is I'd be helping with training somewhere, and I'd go in and I'd see like 2 guys with paintball masks on, 1 guy in a red man suit, and 3 other people with just eye protection on. And I go, are those 2 guys the guys that you're allowed to shoot? And that guy's the guy that you're not allowed to shoot? Yeah, don't shoot the red man suit. Only the guys with the paintball mask, the other 2 guys. And I'm going, well, what's happening is you're threat discriminating by like articles of clothing. Yeah. That's not at all safe or real. You come in there and you're looking for the red suit, right? So I completely changed that around. And this is the whole thing, is like the intensity is what is going to enhance the survivability. And the way to do the intensity is to make sure your role player moves real time, real speed. And that was really what the inspiration was for the high gear suit. So I'm excited for that, and I'm super excited. I don't know what your demographics are, but as far as who listens from Canada or the States or worldwide or whatever. But I grew up in Canada, and I moved to the States in 2007 or 8, and it's exciting to be working with a Canadian company and doing stuff with you guys, and also Jeff and the team and everything you guys have done is like, Shock Knife and some of the other products are as unique as high gear is, in that they solve a problem, and they have an emotional, psychological relationship with the practitioners. And it's incredibly important. So I'm excited to figure out both some training and some gear programs for the operators out there.
Yeah, we're just excited to see what the future of high gear holds now that you're back to having your hand in it, and maybe what things can be added or what has changed in the world that might change in training.
It's interesting, like again, the gear took me 5 years to make. So unless you said, hey, we need high gear for unicorns and high gear for mermaids, like the design of it's not going to change much. I think, let me answer it this way, and I'm sorry, I'm just a natural, passionate storyteller. But when I had a 21,000 foot facility in Virginia, and it was like Disneyland for operators. We had an octagon in there, we had bags, we had air conditioned classrooms, we had a fight house with a basement with a attic. But what I did was, when I designed all the rooms for the shoot house and the fight house, I made all the doors standard door size, and then I made all the rooms 30% smaller. So what would happen is, if you were standing, if you're doing like a CQB entry, and you were standing outside the door psychologically resonated with everything you knew about doors in the real world. But when you came in the room that should have been 12 feet was 6 feet in its measurements. So you would come in and you could never remember that things were happening so fast that you wouldn't remember which room was which. So some rooms were 8, some were 12, some were long. But they were always 30% smaller than any conventional room. And people ask me, like, I had a lot of like tier 1 guys coming through there, and people would ask me, like, why did you do that? And I said, because you fight a bad guy. And the most dangerous bad guy is a close bad guy. So you come into a room that's 20 foot across and there's a guy at the other corner standing there with no furniture, with a gun out. Like, there's no emotional, psychological calibration. You just go, I see him, I got him. Mm-hmm. What I was always like, I recognize this, is that if I could help prepare people for the emotional, psychological impact and stress inoculate them for that, then they're going to be as prepared as they can be for the real event, because it would replicate the most dangerous. Like, all fights are dangerous, but the most dangerous fight is an ambush.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's been our motto for decades. You know, all fights are dangerous. The most dangerous fight is the ambush. How can I create more of that startle, flinch, ambush thing? Because startle isn't just your physical body. It's your brain trying to catch up to what's the reptilian brain is starting to do. Mm-hmm. And that's what we need to do. So, you know, when you ask me, like, what's the future of high gear, you know, that'd be like me saying, hey, what's next for shock knife? Mm-hmm. The genius of it was, hey, this is a knife that looks like a knife, and guess what it does? It's not comfortable if it touches you. Yeah, but what's next? We're gonna put poison on it so you die. No. It's electricity, and it's a knife, and it's a role player. What's next for shock knife would be different sizes and better role player instruction, right? So that, because at the end of the day, we can stand there, and once I get over the fact that, okay, this is gonna suck, like getting tasered or something, it's understanding, how can I use this in as many intelligent ways as possible, so that it's a proof of principle for my principles. How do I manage fear? How do I avoid it in the case of how do I avoid this? And we talk about weapon protection as clear, control, counter. How do I clear myself from this attack? How do I control the arm limb? And how do I counter it, right? And there's a logical sequence. So when people ask me, what's next for spear, I go, well, no, physiology, psychology, and physics aren't going to change. So what's new for spear is better ways to communicate it, so that more people understand it, so more people integrate it. And it's the same thing for high gear. Sure, there may be like a new foam or a slightly new design. And we've got some cool ideas on it, which I don't want to talk about on a show, because we've got a couple of people that do rip us off.
Right.
And so I don't want to say, oh, we're doing this in advance of that. So.
Mm-hmm. Now you're constantly researching. Obviously, that's like a big part of, kind of the ideas and science of it. Is there any area you're currently exploring right now that's kind of like the top of your mind?
No, it's still like digging into the brain and understanding, just my passion is better ways to communicate. I recognized a long time ago that, I got asked in around 1980 again what I want to do, and I said I want to make the world safer. And this guy, who was a venture capitalist I'd been introduced to, he said, "You want to make the world safer?" He goes, "You don't think that's a little grandiose?" Like, in my mind, it was like no, that's what I want to do, and it's what I try to do. But I realized a long time ago that I can't do that myself. So my big focus is on figuring out ways to transfer and transmit and create systems. And it's one of the reasons I reached out to Jeff again and you guys, is how do we create systems, whether it's online training, collaborative education. At the end of the day, it's creating that ignition and inspiring another trainer listening to this to go, holy shit, I got to contact Setcan and find out about this gear, or about the knife, or about scenario training, or Jeff's book, or whatever. Because that's all it is if we can raise the bar and inspire more trainers. Because at the end of the day, like, if Jeff and I decided, okay, that's it, we're setting out on a journey, the two of us are going to make the world safer, there's a limit to what two people can do. But if we can get 200 or 2,000 or 20,000. I was listening to a really good interview that one of the founders of Zumba, right, that fitness dance thing. They've got 400,000 trainers around the world. They got something like 15 million people doing that, right? Like, wow. Like, I believe that every citizen, every good Samaritan, every good person on the planet should understand how to detect and avoid problems, how to de-escalate stuff, and if push some shove, how to be their own bodyguard, right? So how do we get, when you look at random acts of violence and we go, wow, that sucks, right? I mean, every few seconds somebody's getting attacked somewhere. So that's where my focus is how do we get this message out?
Mm-hmm. Now, how would you predict law enforcement training is going to evolve, say, in the next 20 years? Like, I mean, scenario training, I think, is catching on, and the reality-based, aspect is definitely bigger. But I mean, now there's VR goggles and things like that. How do you think it would advance with technology?
I'm on one hand, like I'm this researcher, and on the other hand, I'm like this mad scientist, artist, mm-hmm. that I'm singularly focused like a sniper on what we do. Yeah. And then I'm trying to attract and draw ideas from other mediums to enhance what we do. So I don't look at that like if somebody had if the AI community came up with like a better, you remember when like the FAT simulator came out, right? But look how the technology's evolved. Yeah. As far as that, there's like at the end of the day, if we're not, there's an expression 20 years ago, I was training some guys in the UK, some of their army guys, and I was talking about how important mindset training was over and over again. Mm-hmm. And the guy said to me, and it was an expression they use, he says, we train the kit and not the warrior. We train the kit and not the warrior. You can have all of this stuff, and if that person hasn't worked on their emotional, psychological, physical arsenal as it relates to violence and the intuition, instincts, and intelligence required to operate the human weapon system, then his VR goggles and his SIRT pistol and his shock knife and his high gear is not going to mean shit on Judgment Day.
Right. Well, one more thing I wanted to ask you, just a general, like, what advice would you give, law enforcement trainers who are currently delivering officer safety tactics? Like, what's kind of a message that you would give to someone who's like giving training right now?
I would tell people that it's actually one of the first slides in our instructor development presentation, and it says, "Don't show your students what you can do. Show your students what they can do." And a lot of times we have people who love martial arts, combatives, DT, find themselves in that role because they're the fanatic. They love this stuff, and they've been training every day for 20 years, and they end up teaching the program based on their skill set. So I've seen places where the whole entire academy is focused around the unconscious bias, boxing. Why? Because the guy in charge of DT was a Gold Glove boxer. He loves boxing. And again, I love boxing too. Mm-hmm. Love boxing. But I also know that I've broken my hand in fights. And I know that boxers break their hands with a yard of tape and gloves on, that teaching somebody to strike with a closed fist in the street can be very problematic, especially if you need to transition to a firearm right after you broke your shooting hand. And so again, it's careful what you practice. You might get really good at the wrong thing. Watch out for your unconscious bias, because your role there isn't to be like the guru. Your role there is to enhance the safety and survivability of your students. And that means to continually look at the technology and the systems out there and go, can we improve this? Can we make people safer? And absolutely, you need to, whether you use my research or not, you got to study the emotional, psychological, physical side. Because if you look at dashboard video and body cam, and I said this to a SWAT magazine interview 15 years ago, I was teaching at Smith & Wesson, and they came by and interviewed me. And I said, the litmus test is dashboard video. And he said, what do you mean by that? I said, everyone practices step 1, step 2, do this in their DT room. And then when you watch fights in front of a police car, they never look like anything anyone practiced.
Yep.
And that either means, does the bad guy keep changing how they attack, or are we not preparing people properly?
Yeah. I mean, now there's the evidence there, and people can learn from that.
Yeah. The training should be evidence-based, and it should always be reverse engineered based on that evidence.
That's a great point to end on, and I'd like to thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Tony Blauer. It's been awesome to talk to you, and good luck in the future with everything you're doing.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to doing some excellent work with you guys too. Thank you so much for having me.
This has been the Prepared Warrior Podcast. For more info on our guests or other episodes, check out thepreparedwarrior.com. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for the Prepared Warrior Podcast, email jon@thepreparedwarrior.com.